Welcome. I'm really excited to have you on here today. My name is Jenny Cruikshank, and I'm Assistant Professor of Health and Human Performance at Central Oregon Community College. Go Bobcats. Really excited to be able to introduce Dr. Bethany Gibbs today. I first heard Bethany about a year ago. I was listening to my usual Science Friday on NPR, Mythbusters, and Bethany was on there busting myths about fitness and our sedentary lifestyles. So I find her research really interesting, and I think you guys will too, and quite relevant, which makes me think we should probably listen to her keynote presentation standing instead of sitting. Just a thought. So Dr. Bethany Gibbs is an assistant professor in the Department of Health and Physical Activity and Clinical and Translational Science at the University of Pittsburgh. She trained in cardiovascular epidemiology and studies the prevention and treatment of obesity and cardiometabolic disease through healthy lifestyle behaviors. Her interests include population and intervention studies of physical activity, sedentary behavior, and eating habits as they are related to hypertension, diabetes, and obesity. Most recently, her research has focused on sedentary behavior as a risk factor independent from moderate to vigorous intensity of physical activity. Central Oregon Community College is very fortunate to sponsor such an accomplished keynote speaker, and we appreciate the long journey that you made here today, Bethany from Pittsburgh. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Bethany Gibbs.
Hey, hi everybody. I'm so happy to be here. Thank you so much to Dr. Heil for inviting me out here. I've already met some really nice people and it's beautiful, so I'm really pleased to be here with you today. Here's obligatory disclosure slide. Okay, so I want to start off by telling you what we're going to talk about today. First of all, we're going to define sedentary behavior. I know probably most of you know what I mean when I say sedentary behavior, but there's still some folks out there who aren't sure how we're thinking about it in physical activity epidemiology right now. Here's the little part where I'm going to give you your medicine. We have to talk about how we measure sedentary behavior, because that's really important to talk about the good stuff, which is whether or not we think sedentary behavior is an independent risk factor for cardiometabolic diseases. So specifically today, I'm going to talk about obesity, metabolic disease, and vascular health. All right, so when I started studying physical activity epidemiology 15 years ago, there were two groups of people. There were the exercisers and there were the sedentary people. So if you look at kind of old clinical trials of exercise, they'll say, we recruited 200 sedentary adults. What they mean is they recruited 200 inactive adults. So there's been a bit of a paradigm shift where we're changing the way we use the language. No longer does sedentary mean that you don't exercise. Sedentary, rather, is this lower end on the physical activity continuum. Is that arrow showing up on there? Not really. Okay, well, I'll just tell you where to look. All right, so now when we talk about sedentary behavior, we're talking about very low energy expenditure. Oh, there, see? So good, thank you. All right, here we go. All right, so now when we talk about sedentary behavior, we are talking about activity at the very low end of this physical activity continuum. And as we know, the physical activity continuum is not a new idea. We're just operationalizing it in a new way when we like to think about physical activity patterns. So the Sedentary Behavior Network, I have the URL down here. If you're interested in sedentary behavior research, by all means join this community. How they're defining sedentary behavior is any waking activity characterized by energy expenditure less than 1.5 minutes. So here's an intensity part of the definition. And then also in a sitting or reclining posture. So there's a second part of the definition that's really important with posture. So two parts. So you can imagine this poses a measurement challenge. So one way I like to think about physical activity and sedentary behavior is really in two dimensions. We have people who are very inactive, who do not exercise on the y-axis here, and that goes all the way up to high active, so getting a lot of physical activity. And at the same time, and importantly, independently, we can have people that have high sedentary behavior, all the way up to low sedentary behavior. And of course, people who are inactive and have high sedentary behavior, we expect that's the highest risk group. All right, so let's think about some examples. Say we have a medical assistant. She's on her feet at work all day. She's running into different clinic rooms. She's drawing blood. She's spinning blood. She's taking blood pressures. She goes home. She doesn't formally exercise, but she has a couple little kids, and she's running around with them and doing laundry and packing lunches. So she doesn't have a lot of time to sit down, but she doesn't formally exercise. So this would be an example of somebody who has very little sedentary behavior, but is also quite inactive. How about an example that is an exercise science student? Maybe some of you in the room might have this kind of behavior. I know you get your exercise in, right? You're training for your triathlon, you're out there running, you're teaching classes, you're cycling 100 miles, all those things you do. But then you're sitting in class, you're sitting studying, you may or may not be binge watching. I asked someone earlier, Stranger Things, is that the thing you guys are watching these days? So you might be sitting a lot, even though you exercise. So that's an example of how you could have high sedentary time, but also be active. And this is a lot of people who have, sort of desk jobs too. So what I would encourage you to do is think about sedentary behavior and physical activity independently and understand that both are potentially risk factors. This is a figure from a paper we published a couple of years ago. I was part of a working group that was commissioned by NIH to try to come up with a definition of sedentary behavior, and that's a really long story, and the end of it is I was like a very junior faculty, and it didn't go very well because we tried to say something and then everyone argued with us, so in the end we just put out 2 definitions. I think I had to revise this paper like 4 times before it finally got published. But you'll see here, there's sort of 2 definitions of sedentary behavior. On this side is just an intensity definition. So everything less than 1.5 METs is considered sedentary, no matter what you're doing. Over here is a definition that adds this posture piece. So to be sedentary, it has to be less than 1.5 METs and sitting. And you'll notice here, there's a little area here for low intensity behaviors that are not sitting. Can anyone think about what that might be? Some people in the room are doing it right now. It's standing. So there's a lot of debate right now. Certainly standing doesn't go with sedentary behavior if you think about the Latin root of the word, sedere, which means to sit. But from a health perspective, potentially just standing up isn't really enough to change cardiometabolic risk. So I think where things are going is that so anyway, where we are right now, we're using this posture and intensity definition. I'd say this is the most accepted definition right now. But the sedentary behavior network is still hard at work. And I think where things are going to go is that we are going to actually classify standing as its own behavior. And you might be saying, oh my goodness, why is all this fuss about? Of course, standing is different than sitting and is different than moving. Well, it is important to think about because 1, we have to figure out how to measure it accurately. And 2, when we tell people don't sit so much, we have to tell them what the heck they need to do. Do they just need to stand up or do they actually need to be moving? And these are really important public health questions. So where I think things are going, they haven't gone there yet, but I'd like you all to be on the cutting edge, is that rather than considering sedentary behavior, everything less than 1.5 METs will now be called stationary behavior. And sitting and reclining will remain sedentary behavior, but standing and leaning will no longer be classified as light activity. It will be called stationary behavior. All right, let's talk about measuring sedentary behavior. So measuring sedentary behavior has a lot of the same problems that measuring physical activity has. Well, we know self-report is cheap, and we can do it on a large scale. It has a low participant burden, but it's not very accurate. And if you think about physical activity, people can maybe a little better remember, they went for a run yesterday, or they walk to work every day, and that takes them 45 minutes. But sitting is something we do all day in different patterns, So it's very hard for people to quantify the amount of sitting they do. There's questionnaires that ask one question, there's questionnaires that ask a bunch of different domains, and then you add them all up. In my opinion, none of these are really all that good. A lot of people have used television time, self-reported television time, as a surrogate. We're going to talk about that more in a minute. But if you think about your own television time, is that a very good representation of the amount of time you spend sitting? I know for me it's not. So as far as being a surrogate, I think television time is not very good. Well, I'll show you some data for that here. All right, so this is data from about 450 young adults. It's baseline data from a clinical trial that we were doing in my lab. And they had physical activity and sedentary behavior measured using a SenseWear armband. This is a couple years old, not the best measurement for sedentary behavior, but I think it makes the point. And then we had measurement of sedentary behavior by a few of the popular questionnaires, including television time at the same time. So the first point I want to make is that the correlation between, well, first of all, the folks had about 9 hours a day of sedentary time, a lot. And then when we looked at the correlation between self-reported sedentary time and actual sedentary time, it was not very good. So that's the sort of Spearman coefficients I have circled here, 0.21, 0.32, so quite low. And then we also looked at how much TV they reported to see if that would be related to the overall amount of sedentary time, with the idea that it would serve as a surrogate. So of course we expected the amount of TV time to be less. It was only 2 hours a day. But if you look over here at the correlation between the amount of time spent watching TV and overall sedentary time was not even statistically significant in 400 people. So this just shows you that TV is really not a very good surrogate for overall sedentary time. And you'll see a lot of research out there calling TV time sedentary time. In the same study, we did some criterion validity, where we looked at whether the different measurements of sedentary time related to BMI. We expected that higher sedentary time should be related to BMI directly. And the objective measurement, of course, was statistically significantly. Our two sort of self-reported measures of sedentary behavior were not related at all to BMI. So this sort of, again, suggests that we really have limited validity with our self-report. And then, here's an important part. When we looked at TV, that was significantly related to BMI. So I already just showed you that TV time wasn't associated at all with total sedentary time. So what this is telling me is that TV is a risk factor for obesity. It is associated with obesity through a pathway other than the sitting. And there's a lot of literature supporting this. When you sit and watch TV, you eat mindlessly, you eat more, you're exposed to ads. There's lots of reasons why that association might be there. But I would urge you all to think about TV time as an independent risk factor, not through a pathway of sedentary time. Okay, so you're probably picking up what I'm putting down, that I'm really keen on objective measurement of sedentary behavior. So we're just going to talk about two, I'd say the two most popular ways to measure sedentary behavior right now. One is with an accelerometer, so you guys probably recognize this actograph down here. And what's really important about these accelerometers, one, they get around that issue of self-report because we get minute-by-minute data. And really importantly, we can assess patterns of sedentary behavior. And I'm going to try to make the point today that patterns are really important, not just for identifying risk, but also when we try to move to public health recommendations. So I also want to point out that with the accelerometer, so if I had an accelerometer on right now, and these lovely ladies in the front row also had an accelerometer on right now, guess what all of our accelerometers would be saying we were doing? We'd all be sedentary, right? Because I'm not moving. And if I'm stationary, I am not getting any counts. And so what I'm doing right now would be considered sedentary based on this accelerometer. So anytime you read a study that looks at sedentary time with an accelerometer, just know that's what it actually measured. Okay, so as I mentioned, the pattern of sedentary behavior we are starting to understand is really important. This is, sort of just really exciting paper by Kim and colleagues. They re-looked NHANES accelerometry data. You guys all know what NHANES is. It's a very large, nationally representative survey. They take a little bus and they do very in-depth clinical exams on a representative sample of Americans. It is cross-sectional. And they put an accelerometer on 5,000 people, which is amazing. And so there have been lots of papers looking at sedentary behavior and associating sedentary behavior with risk factors in this population. And a lot of the things you'd expect to come out do come out. But really interestingly, one thing that didn't come out in the initial studies was BMI. We thought sedentary behavior would of course be associated with BMI, and in those initial studies, there was no association. Kim and colleagues reprocessed the data and said maybe not all sedentary time is the same. Maybe short bout sedentary time is not as harmful as long bout sedentary time. And if you think about it, if someone has a really short bout of sedentary time, what does that mean? That means they were moving right before then, and then they were moving again right after then. So these short bouts of sedentary time might not have the risk that the long bouts do, and putting them all together may create a lot of noise that obscures associations. So that's exactly what they found. I just have circled here, for all these different outcomes, waist circumference, HDL, triglycerides, and BMI, what they found was that short bout activity was actually protective. So short bout sedentary time was actually protective for things like obesity, BMI, HDL cholesterol, and only the long bout had risk associated with it. And once you separated things out, if you look down here, and we'll talk about this a little more in a minute, now sedentary behavior was statistically associated with BMI. So this is really important when we think about sedentary behavior as a risk factor. All right, so I'd say the preferred way to measure sedentary behavior now is through an active PAL, which combines an accelerometer with an inclinometer. If you don't know what an inclinometer is, it's basically a device that can tell whether the device is a little flat disc, and the inclinometer can tell whether the device is like this, meaning you're sitting, or if the device is like this, means you're standing, and it's placed right on the front of the thighs. You can see here, this is actually an old one, this one's kind of a little bit big. And it gives you this kind of picture like this, where it can very specifically distinguish between sitting, standing without moving, and then moving. So now we can get better at this definition of stationary behavior, standing versus sitting. I know you might be just wondering, well, how close are the measurements of sedentary behavior when we compare an active graph accelerometer to an active PAL? You probably weren't wondering that, but I'm going to show you anyway. This is a bland almond plot. Can I get a hand raise for anyone that loves bland almond plots? No, just a couple? Got a couple friends out there? All right, thank you. I love these. My students actually frame one for me. I make them all learn how to interpret one. So anyway, the take-home message from this is that if you look at the mean difference here between, so people concurrently wore an active PAL and an active graph, and the mean difference in the minutes of sedentary behavior measured in this particular sample was over 2 hours, meaning that the active graph measured an additional 2 hours of sedentary behavior, which makes sense. It was standing behavior that was low intensity. So we really are measuring something different when we use these different devices. And moving forward, we need to be really careful about interpreting our own research and other people's research with this in mind. Okay, so let's talk about how sedentary are we Americans. This is that same NHANES data, and this is just showing across age and by gender a percentage of time spent in sedentary behavior. So you see kids 6 to 11 here have about 40% of their day spent sedentary. It's pretty flat up here for adults, but it's over 50% of the day is spent sedentary. And then older adults are the most sedentary. I'm sure that doesn't surprise anyone. Okay, so let's talk about the good stuff. Do we think that sedentary behavior is a risk factor for obesity? Well, the media certainly thinks so, right? Have you guys seen? You can't get away from this. I get a lot of media requests about, people. They all want me to say it's definitely a risk factor, and I'm always saying we don't have enough research yet, so then they stop calling. But there's tons of articles about this, and it's awesome to be in a field where the media is excited and where potentially you have a chance to influence behavior and make people get better, but I wish that the media would just back off a little bit until we have a little more evidence. Oh, this is my favorite one where we have these we have these people like evolution, and then it's, somebody in a chair with like a Ghostbuster sign in front of them. Yeah, it's good. Okay. All right, so when we think about sedentary behavior, obesity, there's a physiological mechanism that makes a lot of sense, right? If you are having a large portion of your time at the low end of the energy expenditure spectrum, you're gonna burn less calories, and you may be more prone to energy imbalance and obesity over time. So this is a very sensible argument. This is that NHANES data again that showed you the long bouts versus short bouts. I do just want to point out that when we think about long bouts versus short bouts of sedentary behavior, I just want you to look at the distribution of time here. So this is in that NHANES nationally representative data, 5,000 people. Almost half the time is spent in short bout sedentary behavior. So we don't need to tell people don't ever sit down. We just need to tell people don't sit for a long time. Try to break up prolonged sitting. All right, now when we go over to waist circumference, you'll see that the short bout sedentary behavior actually has a stronger association, protective for waist circumference, and the same thing happens for BMI. So very short bouts, which is just the converse of breaks, right? Having a lot of breaks in your sedentary behavior is really what we need to be telling people when we want to think about increasing energy expenditure and reducing weight gain over time. But NHANES and a lot of other studies have the limitation that they're cross-sectional. So I actually already talked to some students that are taking epidemiology, and so you'll have to bear with me. But of course, our hypothesis is that prolonged sedentary behavior leads to obesity. But the problem with cross-sectional studies, we have an established temporality, right? So it's equally likely that obesity could lead to prolonged sedentary behavior. And if we think about that, that's a plausible idea. People who are obese may have functional limitations to getting up. They may have hormonal or other reasons why they feel tired or have low energy. So there's definitely some meat to the idea that obesity may lead to prolonged sedentary behavior. And what's probably going on is that both things are happening. And in a cross-sectional study, it's quite hard to tease apart these potential different directions of effect. I know this is small, but there's been a few studies that have longitudinal follow-up, so they have measurement of sedentary behavior and obesity at more than one time point that have tried to address this. This is one study by Eklund and colleagues in about 400 British adults. And what they found was that if you measure sedentary behavior at baseline, it did not predict BMI increases over time. But if you measure BMI at baseline, an obese BMI at baseline did predict increases in sedentary time. So this is important because it's suggesting that reverse direction of effect is important. Now that study only had about 400 people, and I believe the impact of reducing sedentary behavior on obesity is probably a subtle one. You might not be able to detect with only 400 people. So we pursued a question of asking whether sedentary behavior was associated with longitudinal weight gain in the Cardia study. If you're not familiar with the Cardia study, it's a very large 5,000 people cohort study, started 30 years ago in 4 U.S. cities. The recruitment was half black, half white, half men, half women, so it was a diverse sample. And for this particular analysis, which I presented at AHA Epi last year and is currently under review, so I'm showing some confidential data here. The way the study was designed is that at baseline, we have an accelerometry measure of sedentary behavior, and we have BMI and waist circumference. And then at 5-year follow-up, we have BMI and waist circumference. Unfortunately, accelerometry was not measured again at this exam, so we only can look at whether sedentary behavior predicts changes in weight. All right, so as I'm sure you could tell, it was very important to me to look at total sedentary time as well as prolonged sedentary time, so I have them both on here. My results weren't as dramatic as the NHANES results, but I still did my due diligence. So when you look cross-sectionally, associations are there just as you'd expect them. People with more sedentary time had a higher BMI. These are beta coefficients associated with 1 hour per day. Prolonged sedentary time has similar effects. Higher prolonged sedentary time was related to higher BMI and waist circumference. And as you'd expect, people who were more physically active had a lower waist circumference and a lower BMI. Now, those are the boring results that we already know. Okay, so here's the exciting results. In this really big cohort, did sedentary time predict changes in weight over 5 years? So total sedentary time here was not statistically associated. Prolonged sedentary time here was statistically associated with increased weight gain over the 5 years. Now look at these beta coefficients. These are small. This is not a big effect, but it's statistically significant, suggesting that being a more sedentary person has a small effect on weight gain over time. Now, really interestingly, this is the MBPA over here, and if you look at these p-values, not statistically significant. So we think about physical activity as being really important for helping with weight maintenance and weight gain prevention, but actually in this cohort, sedentary behavior was more important for predicting weight changes over time. All right, I also want to talk to you about some results I have from a lab study. So that's sort of what I was just talking about was a very much epidemiological population-based study. But I want to talk to you, I know probably a lot of you want to reduce your sedentary time yourself, have clients, have family members. And so I want, we have to think about practical ways to reduce our sedentary behavior and whether or not those are actually going to have an impact on our health. And this is the data I was presenting last year at ACSM, if anyone saw that. So what we did was we had folks come into the lab on 4 different occasions. It was a randomized crossover style. And we had them either sit continuously and do office work. They stood for a half an hour and then sat for a half an hour. They stood for the whole hour, or they took 2 2-minute walks every 30 minutes. So, sorry, 1 2-minute walk every 30 minutes. So 2 walks over the hour. We used a metabolic cart to see how much extra energy expenditure they were going to have. And I really got inspired to do this study because I saw some kind of outrageous claims in some pretty popular newspapers that were saying using a sit-stand desk was going to help you burn like 400 calories a day. And I thought, boy, that's really a disservice to the public to be telling them something so ridiculous. So I extrapolated the results over an 8-hour workday with all these different sort of routines. And you'll see here, I have a bar graph showing the amount of additional energy expenditure, so above sitting, that would be expected if you did each of these different routines. And these are across different weights, but I'll just go over the 80 kilogram results because that might be applied to some of you. So if you stand up for half the day and sit down for half the day at a standing desk compared to just sitting, 45 extra calories a day. Definitely not 400. I think that some people are really disappointed when they see that. They want to be burning a lot more calories. But I think we just need to change our frame. And we need to say, standing up at your desk, it doesn't interrupt your work. You get a lot of other benefits. You probably feel a lot better doing it. So, and you get 45 extra calories every day on top of it. So I think we should try to look at it in a more positive light. If you stood all day, which would not be ergonomically recommended, but if you did, you would burn an extra 70 calories. But taking just 2 2-minute walks every hour, so that'd be 16 walks over the day, that may or may not be possible, but that would be an extra 142 calories a day. So probably the real answer that's practical and is actually going to work in an office setting is to do some combination of these things. Use your standing desk, take walks when you can. All right, so to the question, does sedentary behavior increase your risk for obesity? There's certainly strong cross-sectional evidence that that's the case, but we really need to be careful about reverse causality because I think it's real. There's limited but emerging prospective evidence that suggests that maybe sedentary behavior has a small effect, and replacing sitting with light activity, specifically walking, maybe to a lesser extent standing, could prevent weight gain over time as sort of this small change theory that, we get a little bit of extra energy expenditure every day. That might be really helpful for weight maintenance. Is it going to really be the thing that's going to help people get over the edge with weight loss? Probably not. It's not going to, you can obliterate it with one cookie. But if you do it every day and accumulate it over time, it might be a really important part of your weight maintenance strategy. And lastly, there's, and you're going to hear me say this again and again, we are waiting. There's some trials going on and more being proposed right now. We need clinical trials showing us if we experimentally change sedentary behavior, what happens to weight. For this outcome of weight, I think we actually need much longer follow-up than your typical 3 or 6 month trials. I think we're not going to see any kind of weight benefit for years. So I'm looking forward to that evidence. All right, so let's talk about metabolic disease. Probably the first big splash that got the media all excited was some of these big meta-analyses that came out that said, sedentary behavior, people in the highest group of sedentary behavior have 2 times the risk of developing diabetes. There was several big meta-analyses that came out and got people really excited, which was great. But if you dig down in some of these papers, specifically this paper, almost all of these papers measured sedentary behavior by TD time. So we already talked about that, right? So that, for me, is not very strong evidence that sedentary behavior is a risk factor for diabetes. So we really have very little evidence that sedentary behavior, sitting, is going to increase our risk for obesity. Now, there's certainly a physiological mechanism. There's been and continue to be some very elegant studies. This study by Hamburg and colleagues did the ultimate sedentary behavior intervention, which is bed rest. They had folks, healthy individuals, have 5 days of bed rest, and they did an oral glucose tolerance test before and after. So you'll see here, this is the insulin response. So this black bit is the insulin response to the OGTT at baseline. And then here's the insulin response, same folks after just 5 days of bed rest. So certainly this is giving us an idea that if we don't use our muscles, they do not work as well with glucose disposal. And that makes a lot of sense. This study by Buckley and colleagues, although it's not the most elegant, there's been many more elegant randomized crossover studies since this, but this is the first one that came out. What they did was they put continuous glucose monitors on some insurance workers, and they gave them a standardized lunch, and then this blue here is their postprandial glucose response. Then that night when they went home, they changed out all their desks and made them standing-only desks. And then the next day they gave them the same standardized lunch. And then this yellow is their postprandial glucose response on the second day. So you can see, just standing up at a standing desk for 1 day was allowing improved glucose disposal, and that makes sense. You're standing, you're having muscle contractions, things are just working better. So there's certainly a biologically plausible idea here, but there's almost no evidence, and especially no prospective evidence, suggesting that sedentary behavior predicts long-term diabetes risk. So hopefully you remember the obesity study I was just talking about. I did a very similar analysis in the Cardia study looking at incidence of pre-diabetes and diabetes. So once again, we had sedentary behavior measured at baseline by accelerometer, and then we had 5 years of follow-up. And we looked for incident pre-diabetes and diabetes. So first I want to show you the cross-sectional evidence, which I'm always just showing you to show you how there's almost always a cross-sectional association, and there's often not a longitudinal association. So if you look over here, you can see that with increasing category of sedentary behavior, the risk of diabetes increased almost 4-fold for the highest group over 10 hours. And you'll see here a very similar thing for impaired glucose tolerance, and that makes a lot of sense with the biological mechanism I was just showing you. Glucose disposal does not happen as well for people that are more sedentary. So this is cross-sectional. We threw out the people that already had disease, and we looked to see if being more sedentary at baseline predicted development of diabetes over the next 5 years. And nothing. No signal. So, there's a lot of reasons why, aside from the fact that maybe sedentary behavior is not a risk factor for developing diabetes, there's some other reasons that could explain these results. Maybe our follow-up wasn't long enough. maybe we didn't have additional measures of physical activity that we needed to. We just had one at baseline, and then we followed them over 5 years. So I'm certainly looking for more prospective studies, but we really don't have a lot of evidence right now from observational studies that suggests sedentary behavior is a risk factor for diabetes. This is another study kind of showing the same thing, but interest of time, we'll move on. Okay, so a lot of people, because the physiological mechanism is so robust and so many people have shown this, that breaking up sedentary time is improving glucose control. There's been some really elegant studies in people that have diabetes where breaking up your sedentary time is really helping with glucose control. So I definitely think there's a role for studying sedentary behavior as a potential therapeutic agent in diabetes. And I'm looking forward to more research that determines the impact of sedentary behavior on diabetes, but it may be very acute. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about is sedentary behavior as it relates to hypertension and vascular disease, and this is probably my main area. So there's lots of studies showing that sitting time predicts cardiovascular mortality. And although with diabetes there's been many studies, looking at the mechanisms, it's not so clear what the mechanism is for cardiovascular disease. Why would sedentary time link to an increased risk for cardiovascular disease? Something that's just emerging, a couple of studies have shown in young adults who have no overt cardiovascular disease that being in the highest group of sedentary behavior measured objectively is associated with arterial stiffness. So that is potentially one pathway through which sedentary behavior could influence cardiovascular disease. But then we just back up one step and say, well, then how does sedentary behavior influence arterial stiffness? All right, so this is that same bed rest study, 5 days of bed rest. And what these folks did was they used plethysmography to look at calf blood flow. And what they found was that after 5 days of bed rest, if you can see here, the black is the calf blood flow at the beginning, and then the white down here is calf blood flow after 5 days of bed rest. So almost immediately we see an effect where blood is pooling in the calves and is not coming back to the central circulation. This is a study by Rostiano and colleagues that 6-hour sitting protocol and what happened to micro and macrovascular function. So you can see here, this is resting mean blood flow. Before they started the sitting protocol, this was mean blood flow. After 2 hours, very much lower. That was sustained over the whole 6 hours. The protocol then had sort of a 10-minute walk at the end where, of course, blood flow was completely restored, suggesting that we should all get up and take a walk after, an hour of sitting. All right. So they also looked at hyperemic response as well as FMD, and a similar story is told. After sitting for 6 hours, vascular function was impaired in the calves specifically. So this may be a mechanism, right? If blood is pooling in the calves, that means it's not coming back up to the central circulation. That means it's not running past the kidneys. And there may be compensatory mechanisms that push blood up by increasing blood pressure and arterial stiffness. And that's sort of the hypothesis that I've been working with lately. So this is a study by Larson and colleagues out of the folks in Australia. And if you're a sedentary behavior researcher, a lot of the good stuff comes out of Australia. This is a study where they had folks come in to do a simulated workday. They either sat all day, or they took they took a 2-minute walk every 20 minutes, either light intensity or moderate intensity. So we can argue about whether a 2-minute walk every 20 minutes is really a translational, prescription, but proof of concept. They of course hypothesized that breaking up sitting would decrease blood pressure. So you'll see here, this is the mean blood pressure over the whole day, and systolic and diastolic blood pressure were both lowered by 2 or 3 points. You may have the same response that you had to the amount of extra energy expenditure for using a standing desk. The effect is small, but I want to argue that this is something that we do all day, every day. And so, of course, one day of standing up a little more or breaking up our sitting, if it can have this kind of small effect and we can collect that over time, might be really important. All right, so we thought 2 minutes every 20 minutes, that's probably more than we would be able to leave our desk. We wanted to understand whether just standing up was enough to achieve maybe one of these blood pressure benefits. So we conducted, this is hot off the press, we conducted a randomized crossover study where folks came into the lab for it was a 10-hour day, it was very long. They either sat continuously, or they stood for half hour, sat for half hour, stood for half hour, sat for half hour. So they never left their desk. We didn't really let them leave. If they had to go to the bathroom, we let them leave, but otherwise they had to stay at their desk and do their work. And we did a vascular testing battery at the beginning of the day, which included blood pressure and pulse wave velocity. We measured blood pressure throughout the day. Then at lunchtime, we measured blood pressure and pulse wave velocity again. We gave them a standardized lunch. Again, work period, measured blood pressure throughout the day, and then at the end of the day, we measured pulse wave and blood pressure again. So these are the blood pressure results. The white is the stand, I call it stand-sit because they stood first. The white is sort of the standing day, and the black is the sitting day. So you'll see there was a benefit. Blood pressure is slightly lower. If you average it over the whole time, it's about 1 point. This was not statistically significant for systolic blood pressure, but it was for diastolic and mean arterial pressure. So a really small effect, but still an effect. And I think potentially the more exciting results are what we saw with pulse wave velocity. So this was carotid femoral, the central pulse wave velocity, central arterial stiffness. And you can see these lines are pretty much superimposed. We didn't see a big effect here. But over here on top, we have the carotid radial pulse wave velocity, and here is carotid ankle pulse wave velocity. So these are measuring more peripheral measures of arterial stiffness. And you'll see here there was a pretty striking effect where the stand-sit condition did have a lower stiffness in the middle of the day. I still don't have a reason. If anyone has a good idea, I'd be open to hear it. Why it went down and then went back up, because the protocol was very standard. But it does look like the stiffness in the periphery was decreased when someone was just using a sit-stand desk to alternate postures. And this makes a lot of sense if we think about the mechanisms we're talking about, which is blood pooling in the calves, potentially oxidative stress, and decreased microvascular function in the periphery. So I'm really excited to have these results and get them out there. Okay, so is sedentary behavior a risk factor for vascular disease? Well, we certainly think it's a risk factor for cardiovascular mortality. I think we're just starting to understand the impact of prolonged sitting on sedentary behavior. And there's very limited research as far as clinical trials and prospective studies with objective measurements. So I'm doing some of that now, and I'm really looking forward to others getting more results out there, but we still kind of don't know. Okay, so in summary, I hope I've convinced you that sedentary behavior is not the opposite of exercising. It's its own sort of independent behavior. We talked a little bit about how potentially standing is another distinct behavior that we should study, mainly because we need to be able to tell people what they need to do. Is standing enough, or do we actually have to move? Do I think the evidence is strong that sedentary behavior is a risk factor for these outcomes? Well, there's certainly lots of cross-sectional associations. We're certainly identifying a lot of biologically plausible acute physiological mechanisms, and that's exciting. It gives a lot of strength to our ideas, but we still need the longitudinal evidence, and maybe even more so, we need the experimental evidence that shows decreasing sedentary behavior is going to change health. What do I think people studying sedentary behavior need to be doing? Well, we need more population studies with the right measurement, with active pound measurement. We need to think about patterns of sedentary behavior. We need to be thinking about prolonged sedentary behavior and how that influences risk, not just total, because it's easier. And we need to be doing the clinical trials that test the effects of health outcomes. Importantly, when we develop these clinical trials, we also need to develop effective sedentary behavior interventions. So we need smart behavioral people out there to come up with ways to get people to sit less because we don't really know how to do that very well yet. All right, well, I'd like to, first of all, thank the committee and everybody who organized this meeting again for having me. It's lovely to be here. I'd like to acknowledge my lab at the Physical Activity and Weight Management Research Center at Pitt, under the direction of the indomitable John Jakisik, who's my mentor and a co-investigator on a lot of the research I presented today. I'd like to thank all my graduate students, all the participants. These are my 2 PhD students right here who are actually graduating this year, so if anyone's interested in sedentary behavior research, do come talk to me. And of course, I'd like to acknowledge all my funding, and all of you, thank you. Thank you so much.
All right, we have plenty of time for questions, please. And if you tend to talk quietly at all, this microphone is here for that very purpose, so you can walk on up here. Have a few people in line to ask questions, and Bethany will do her best to answer those one at a time. Or otherwise, Bethany, you can just point at people and...
People are raising their hand. Okay, sure.
You already mentioned the need for longitudinal data, but from any data you've already collected, is there evidence of plasticity in this? So if you were sedentary for multiple decades, but then change that pattern, are there different outcomes?
That's a great question. So if anyone couldn't hear, the question is there any evidence that sort of being sedentary and then changing that behavior to become unsedentary, is there any, she's the great word, plasticity in the risk? We would be thrilled if there was just 2 time points of measurement of sedentary behavior right now. So I think that is an awesome question, but we haven't even been able to look at longitudinal measurement of sedentary behavior right now. So we need to do that, but we can't do it quite yet. But for example, the cardio study I mentioned, they're measuring accelerometry right now in their 30-year exam. So we're going to have serial measurement and can look at questions like that. So thank you. That's a great idea. I have no idea. So I'm looking forward to studying stuff like that.
Hi, Chris Minson from University of Oregon. I just published a couple papers end of last year, and we used the term sedentary. I didn't like that at all, and I've realized now we should have used inactive, and that was really helpful to say that. So thanks for that. I did a couple quick questions or points, I guess, to make. One is using pulse rate velocity for arterial stiffness. Arterial stiffness can take a while to change. It's not going to change over a day. It's not going to change over a week. It's got to be over multiple weeks.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're using pulse rate velocity in a short time period, you're really probably looking at more of an indirect marker of endothelial function.
I totally agree. And I'm sorry I didn't go into it very much, but 100% agree.
So if you start thinking about and when you start thinking about what's happening with pulse rate or endothelial function over a short time frame like that, is after lunch you saw a drop, then I start thinking about we were thinking about glucose regulation after the meal, whether that changed endothelial function. In that case, a drop might show improved endothelial function when you're standing versus sitting. With the same thing, you referred to the VOP data, venous occlusion plethysmography data they used. Was used, it was saying for pooling the leg. It looked to me like a Resch-Pipe Raymond test, which would be, so it looked 45 seconds. I didn't see it was up only for a couple seconds, but so if that's the case, that's actually going to be a measure of your microvascular function, not pooling.
Again, thank you so much. That data I did show was about the microvascular sort of response. They did measure actual pooling, throughout. They measured it over a time period and sort of suggested that it was pulling in the leg in that paper, but not necessarily in that figure. Thanks.
Great, thanks.
Hey there, I'm Lindy. I actually work in Chris's lab. I feel like if I knew that someone was tracking my activity, my behavior would probably change. So I'm just curious if you know of anyone who's looked at, I'm sure plenty of data that is available that has already been collected in Fitbits that everyone is wearing around now.
As far as sedentary behavior is concerned?
Yeah, and patterns of sedentary behavior.
Sure. So I know there are some initiatives. There's a huge initiative out of Stanford to use cell phones, and that people are wearing to track sedentary behavior. I'm not sure if Fitbit wants to give up their data. I know some people have looked at Fitbit and looked at activity patterns. The problem with Fitbit is it's on your wrist, and it does just a really bad job of measuring your sedentary behavior. So while I think it might be good for looking at something like stationary behavior a little better, because it monitors steps, okay? I think as far as actual sitting and prolonged sitting, it probably couldn't do very well. I really agree with you. There might be sort of a Hawthorne effect when we measure people's behavior. But what I find is really interesting is that we've actually done some of this research to see in our own lab when we put active pals on people. We look at the first couple of days and the next couple of days because we think that people might be more reactive in the first couple of days than the second couple of days. And what we found is that it's exactly the same. There's no difference in those 2 days. So I agree with you that it seems that there might be a Hawthorne effect, but we haven't found evidence of it yet so far. But I like your idea about using, kind of pre-existing data sources. I would just caution you about sort of commercial devices and sedentary behavior because they don't do a very good job measuring.
Great, thank you.
Hi, Chris Connolly from Washington State University. Thank you for a very, very nice presentation. I have 2 questions for you. My first is, you talked at the beginning about classifying sitting and standing potentially in the future as stationary activity. Would both, you think, be in that category?
Yes, yeah. So the overarching idea is stationary, and then within stationary there's sedentary and standing, and then light activity is something else.
Okay, so it's...
Right now, standing is considered light activity.
Right, but standing still would have its own...
It'd be its own thing.
Separate thing from
Yeah.
sitting, suggesting it's meaningfully better than sitting potentially, right?
Well, we have to see.
Any idea when such a...
When
that
we
would
move to
happen?
that, I don't know.
I always seem to get dinged on sedentary and something.
I know. It's hard to keep up. I think right now still folks are using the posture plus intensity definition. So I think that the Sedentary Behavior Research Network is looking to put out a large position paper. So hopefully that will be well publicized and we'll all use the right terms.
Great, thank you. My second question is with respect to, I know you're talking on this a little bit tomorrow, with respect to sit to stand and then stand to sit. Do you think potentially that some of the effects that we're seeing in the literature are not a result of standing, but rather of the dynamic movement of getting up, sitting down, getting up, sitting down? It seems to me that the emphasis is always placed on the benefit of standing, when it occurs to me that maybe we haven't done
You have to get up to stand.
And how do we separate those two out and look at the effects?
Yeah, I one time in our little lab group proposed to try to look at that specifically. I wanted to, in this study that I just presented, I wanted to have people control the amount of standing time, but have like twice or 3 times, like have them change every 10 minutes versus changing every 30 minutes and see if there was a difference. And my boss was like, wow, you've gone too far. So I think that's a good question that maybe we can tackle later. But I mean, when you think about the public health implication, right? More breaks are better, frequent posture changes. If it's certainly you shouldn't stand all day. That's not ergonomically, a good idea either. We should avoid static postures. So I think, is it the getting up or the standing? It doesn't really matter, right, as long as people stand up. But I agree with you. I'm not sure. I'm not sure what the answer is.
Thanks very much.
Hi, thank you for presenting. I think it's enlightening how little energy expenditure there was from sitting to standing. I think you said 45 calories.
For an 8-kilogram person.
Yeah, so I was surprised by that. So I'm wondering if there's any other benefits of any other areas like low back pain or even like wrist pain from typing or even job satisfaction that may affect other areas of life that may have a mindset advantage that.
Yeah, this is a great point, and I was trying not to talk about that because I'm going to be talking about it tomorrow. So I think maybe the strongest evidence supporting sit-stand desks is in ergonomics, is in decreasing pain and improving energy and attention. So I think that is for sure a huge benefit, and if you get a little calorie boost and 1 millimeter of mercury lower diastolic blood pressure, that's all extra bonus stuff as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah. Are you aware, I don't know, that's why I'm asking, but is there any data like on job satisfaction or even job performance versus postures and walking and things like that?
Yeah, so there's some folks doing that kind of research, productivity, mood, So the research when you install sit-stand desks is typically showing that people improve their mood, are happier, have more energy, and it's sit-stand desks are kind of popular right now, so it's a little hard to tease out, like, are you just happy that your boss got you a sit-stand desk, or is it actually the effect of the sit-stand desk, right? You can't, those two things can't happen in isolation. So it's kind of hard to tease that out exactly, but either way, if people are happier and can focus and pay attention better, who cares what the reason is, right?
Thank you.
I think I might be the last one. Thank you again for an enlightening presentation. Annika from Eastern Washington University. I had a quick question, if not maybe a suggestion. I was curious whether or not you did a comparison or tracked the age of the participants, particularly in the blood pressure. I'm wondering if there was a comparison from the younger population to the older adults in the workplace.
Thank you so much. That's a great question. We only had 25 subjects. We did have a huge range, though. We had people that were 22. We had someone who was 65. So we had quite a range in age. And I was like struggling to get this data analysis done for getting here. So I haven't looked yet to see if there are predictors of a better blood pressure response. We're certainly interested in that. Most of the other crossover studies have shown that, of course, if you have a higher blood pressure to begin with, that you're going to see a greater benefit. But we are definitely going to look at age as one of the factors. I would imagine older people might have a better response, but I don't know.
I would love to see that. And along with that, maybe some of that blood pooling in the lower extremities. But thank you again.
Okay.
Hi, short here. I was just curious if you knew of any research about seated exercises, looking at the same sort of constructs as things like ankle pumps, quad sets, bicep curls, that kind of thing.
I think that's a really great question. I have a few colleagues that are doing that kind of research with the under the desk bikes. And you sort of mentioned, not necessarily just seated, but there's also sort of a growing group. Actually, one of my doctoral students is doing this as his dissertation project, looking at breaking up sitting with resistance exercises and the effect of that on blood pressure and glucose disposal. There was a really nice study out of the Australian group that took people with diabetes, and they did again, it was sort of a very intense 3 minutes every 30 minutes of resistance training breaks, but their glucose was lower, their blood pressure was way lower, like 16 points lower over the day. So very dramatic effects by doing exercise breaks. And we say this all the time as practitioners, right? Just do like some desk push-ups at your desk, but we don't know if they really have health implications. But when we look at it as compared to a sitting posture all day, we're actually starting to see some health implications. So I think it's really important. And I think that I haven't seen seated particularly, but I don't know why the results wouldn't be the same.
Yeah, you think it'd almost be easier for people to do something seated than to have to stand at a standing desk, and like you said, it's not great ergonomically either. So
it's just not great to do it all day, but it can be quite good, if you change posture all day. I'm a standing desk user for sure.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Donald from Eastern Washington University also. I was curious, in your studies, you looked at activity during seating times. Other studies you talk about whether they were standing, whether they're seating, whether they're standing up. I was curious, I can't sit still ever. And I'm just curious if you looked into that also, if there was a difference in sitting still versus sitting more actively, or if it was just seated versus standing.
Yeah, so in this study, we were very much trying to test a very applied prescription of standing up for half an hour, sitting for half an hour, and having sat in the lab with a lot of these participants for 10 hours, there was a range of fidgeting and what they were doing. So we didn't particularly collect that. I will tell you that we did have an active PAL on these folks, and there was some really interesting things, like they were in the lab for 10 hours, but there were only certain periods where they were at the desk. And some people during the not at the desk periods, like when they were eating or when they were getting their testing done, some people stood the whole time, like they couldn't stand it because they had been sitting so long, and other people didn't really compensate that way at all. So we definitely saw some intra-individual differences in the behavior when we weren't forcing them to sit at the desk. We didn't look at that specifically, but there is a whole literature about fidgeting, especially with energy expenditure, which, I haven't looked, but I imagine people are looking at it. I imagine it would have similar cardiovascular effects. So it's a good idea.
Thank you.
You should check it out. I think you're talking about this other person study, this one. So this is the trajectory of blood pressure across the whole day. And so as you can see, we know there's variation in blood pressure across the day. So it looked, to me, it looks pretty sustained delta that happens, pretty much across the whole day. But there is a little bit of a trick with measurement when you do those short walks or when we are standing. We very specifically only measured blood pressure when people were sitting for at least 10 minutes because you don't want postural changes or recent activity to influence that activity or to influence the blood pressure measurement. So yeah, there's some little nuances with that. I don't know if that's what you're getting at, but. Beyond the workday, I'm not sure.
Hi, my name's Kelsey from Oregon State, and I just have one question. You had a figure up there that was the sitting versus switching, standing and sitting, and then the walking. And I was just curious, the walking, was sitting the control for that, and then walking, so were they sitting the whole time and then the 2-minute walk? And is that effect additive? So is there an added effect for standing and then walking versus sitting and walking?
Yeah, so this was looking at energy expenditure, and I think that's a great point, because if you heard me, I think that's what we need to recommend that people are doing. They're doing some standing because that is going to give you a small benefit and can be done at your desk without interrupting your work. But then adding in a few walks. I haven't seen studies that are adding, people are typically, actually not many people are really studying standing as it is, probably because it doesn't have a very large effect and it's a lot of work for 1 millimeter of mercury. But I think importantly, the intervention studies that I'm doing right now, we're doing both. We're doing standing and walking. So I think putting this together is important, although I haven't seen studies doing that specifically.